new book is raising questions about the safety of generic drugs coming into the United States. According to the FDA, 9 out of 10 prescriptions filled are for generic drugs, and that saves Americans around $3 billion a week over the cost of brand name drugs. 80% of active ingredients in generic and 40% of finished drugs come from outside of the United States. CBS News correspondent Anna Werner has more on the rising concerns about whether the federal government is ensuring the safety of these drugs.
I'm thankful that I'm still here.
When we met Cedric Brown, he was in the hospital for a foot infection. But that was a big improvement from 7 years ago, when his heart failed and he underwent a transplant.
Did you feel really different after you got the transplant?
Definitely, I felt great.
The operation was a success, but months later, Brown's condition deteriorated, and he came back to the Cleveland Clinic, where Dr. Randall Starling found Brown's body was rejecting his new heart.
We had to figure out why. Why did this happen to Cedric?
Dr. Starling discovered that the brand name anti-rejection drug Brown had been taking, called Prograf, had been switched for a generic manufactured in India.
You look at this bottle, and I take it questions were immediately raised in your mind.
Immediately.
Questions because that particular drug was on a list of generic medications his hospital tries to avoid prescribing to its patients. The FDA says a generic medicine is the same as a brand name medicine in dosage, safety, and quality. But experts at the Cleveland Clinic have determined some generics aren't a close enough match for their comfort, that even a small variance in the drug may pose serious risks for some patients.
So you can't take the risk that a drug is just slightly less than what the patient needs, or maybe more.
In a given patient that's high risk for rejection, there may be no leeway whatsoever.
I remember him saying it was the medication that caused what happened to me.
And so then, did things get better after that?
Sure. Oh, yeah, definitely. Still here.
It's a window into a larger problem, says investigative journalist Catherine Eban.
This is all I have done for the last 5 years.
She wrote a book called Bottle of Lies. She says the problem is that the U.S. relies on information submitted by drug makers in order to approve their generic medications. But some overseas manufacturers aren't being honest.
There are many companies in the industry that are falsifying their data.
Falsifying data, straight out.
Straight out fraud.
The first major fraud case came to light 14 years ago, that of Indian generic manufacturer Ranbaxy. The company paid a $500 million penalty as part of a 2013 settlement for selling adulterated drugs and making fraudulent statements to the FDA. Former Ranbaxy executive Dinesh Thakur was the whistleblower on the case.
Are they the poster child for how bad things can get?
I wish I could say that. I've seen similar behavior in other companies since 2013.
So they're not the only ones?
No.
Eban says a major part of the problem is the FDA's efforts to regulate overseas drug production.
Our entire drug supply has changed. Now these drugs are overseas and the FDA is forced to be a global agency. So the question is it up to the task or not?
And how well is that going for them, did you find?
Very badly.
She explains that while FDA inspectors in the U.S. often show up at plants unannounced, overseas companies are frequently warned weeks in advance that inspectors are coming.
These inspections that are taking place overseas are essentially staged inspections.
Staged? What do you mean by staged?
They're staged by the companies.
The FDA told us in a statement that it inspects all brand name and generic manufacturing facilities around the world and says it's conducted a number of unannounced inspections at foreign plants when the agency has information from a whistleblower or when the FDA is investigating a drug safety issue. But this former FDA investigator told us when he and others dug deeper into the records at those companies, they found serious problems.
Did you see problems that you considered to be fraud?
Yes.
We're not showing his face or using his real voice, but reports he and other inspectors filed show they found numerous generic drug makers falsifying records, covering up manufacturing problems, and attempting to hide poor test results.
If the data is not accurate, or if the data is falsified,
Right.
do we know what the drug is that's coming out on the end for sure?
We would question the safety and efficacy of those drugs, yeah.
The FDA says it's modernized its policies in recent years and that Americans can be confident in the quality of the products the FDA approves. But those inspection reports came as unwelcome news to Dr. Starling.
My initial reaction is anger. To falsify information, to manufacture and make a profit on a drug is just unconscionable to believe that that could happen.
The group that represents generic drug makers disagrees. It says the industry is contributing hundreds of millions of dollars to help the FDA increase the frequency of inspections. And it notes if there are issues going undetected by the FDA, they say there would be severe health issues in this country.
So, listen, Anna, you talked about the Cleveland Clinic and how they sort of have a list of drugs that they watch out for. Is that just the list that they keep for themselves? Do other hospitals have lists like this? Do they share this information?
So it's not clear to me how many hospitals might be keeping a list. That is the Cleveland Clinic's own list. They have a committee that looks at this issue specifically and talks about various drugs and whether they've had problems. Cedric is not the only patient that they had a problem with this one generic with. They've had several patients that have had problems. And I think what Dr. Starling would tell you is, as he told us, that there needs to be more physician awareness around the country about these issues so that at the very least physicians are aware, hey, you might want to check in with some of your colleagues at the Cleveland Clinic or somewhere else and see, did you have any problems? Some of these drugs, especially for like heart transplant patients, they have a very narrow range that they have to hit in terms of, variance. And if they don't get that range, that precisely, then it can have health effects. So a lot of drugs, it doesn't matter if you have, as according to the doctor, that a little bit of variability, but for a heart transplant patient or other patients like that, high-risk patients, it can be critical.
I've heard people sort of complain that they got switched to a generic and they didn't think it was the same, and the doctor is sort of insisting, no, it's exactly the same, and perhaps it is. But you're right about doctors talking to each other and maybe sharing some of these stories. The other thing that I thought when I watched this is, so we've got that company, Ranbaxy, it's a $500 million fine. Is that the only tool that the FDA has in terms of getting these companies to no longer display fraudulent behavior or come into compliance?
The tough thing is you have to ask whether the FDA's inspection system really works overseas the way it should. The former FDA person that we interviewed in that segment that you saw would tell you that they need more resources at the FDA, that that they're trying to do the best job they can, but also they're dropping down into a different country. So that's a little bit different than when you're going around and doing inspections in the United States. Maybe you don't speak the language. Maybe you're working through an interpreter. Maybe you're not as familiar with, the way that they're running the systems there. So one of the things that Dinesh Thakur, who was the Ranbaxy whistleblower, would tell you is that he's trying to change the systems and change the practices in India from within India. He's working on several fronts to try to change it within India because he says that you can't just drop down from the U.S. with some inspections and expect to address what could be systemic problems in some manufacturing facilities or in companies, that you need to address it from the India side and try to emphasize having the same standards across the board for everybody and the importance of those standards.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anna Werner, thank you very much.
You're welcome.